Hello there, my name's James Kelly. Welcome back to Scot Goes Pop. I did warn you, didn't I? So the big news of today is that we at last have the first full-scale Scottish Parliament poll since June, and it comes from More in Common, which is a surprise because they're not frequent contributors to the Scottish polling scene. But it's very good news for the SNP. On the constituency ballot, the SNP have 37% of the vote. Labour have just 17%, but they are in second place, just ahead of Reform UK on 16%. The Liberal Democrats are in joint fourth place on 12%. Conservatives are also on 12%, and the Greens are on 5%. And on the regional list ballot, the SNP have 32% of the vote. Reform UK are in joint second on 16%. Labour also in joint second on 16%. The Liberal Democrats clearly ahead of the Conservatives on the list with 14%. The Tories just have 12% and the Greens have 8%. Now, because More in Common don't poll very often for Holyrood, or maybe they haven't at all, I can't see any sign that they have before. It's difficult to make exact comparisons with previous polls. We have to make sort of apples and oranges comparisons with polls from other companies. But what we can say is that the 37% for the SNP is the highest showing for the SNP in any poll from any polling company since December of last year, which was a Norstat poll, which also had the SNP on 37%. All the polls since then have had the SNP ranging between 32 and 35%. So it may mean that the SNP's position has improved a bit recently, or it may just be a house effect of More in Common. We don't know. The 17% for Labour on the constituency ballot does look like a total disaster for Anna Sauer's party, although it is true there was one poll a few months ago that had them in a worse position than that. That was the Find Out Now poll for the National in April, which had them on just 14%, but everything else has had them on at least 18%, and has only been, well, the vast majority of polls have had them on 19% or above, so 17% does look pretty bad for Labour. For the Tories, 12% may look bad on the constituency ballot, but actually there have been worse polls than that. And the last two polls had them lower than that. The YouGov poll in June had them on 10%, as did the Ipsos poll in June. That also had them on 10%. So although things are calamitous for the Tories, they haven't actually got any worse, apparently. For the Greens, of course, the most important, well, the only important figure is the list vote, where they're on 8%. And there has been this person on my blog who has been trying to implant the idea that the Greens are suddenly doing extremely badly since John Swinney announced his controversial independence plan, saying that everybody has to vote SNP, otherwise it won't count towards the mandate for an independence referendum. And this guy is trying to implant the idea that everybody is suddenly taking their cue from that and stop voting Green, and that their vote share has fallen off a cliff. I mean, politics does not work like that. Very much doubt if most voters, let alone, well, even most pro-independence voters, even know the details of John Swinney's plan, so it wouldn't have that big an effect. However, 8% for the Greens, that is a bit on the low side, actually. That's the worst showing for the Greens since December 2024 in any poll from any polling company. Oh no, I tell a lie, it's the worst since March of this year, but everything since March has had them between 9 and 15%. So 8% is on the low side. So maybe the Greens are struggling a little bit, but I wouldn't jump to any conclusions as to the reasons for that if that is the case. And now to the seats projection, the all-important seats projection, which is pretty remarkable because the SNP are projected to be on 61 seats, which is only down 3 on the 2021 election result. In second place would be Reform UK on 17 seats. Labour would be in third place on 16, which would be their worst ever result in history. The Liberal Democrats would have a pretty good result on 15, back to the days of well, the late 90s, early 21st century, when they were at that sort of level. The Conservatives would be on 14, and the Greens would be on 6, which would be a disappointing result for the Greens. It would be 2 seats worse than their 2021 result. So does this mean, I mean, obviously that means that the SNP are just 4 seats short of an overall majority. Does this mean that we've been doing John Swinney a disservice and it actually is planned to get an overall majority and win a referendum that way, that it could work? No, it does not, because the reason for that is because the SNP are getting a sort of winner's bonus on the constituency ballot. Their share of the constituency vote is considerably lower, even on this poll, than it was in 2021. But they're kind of maxing out the possible winner's bonus among constituency seats because they've got such a big lead over the second place party. But they've gone about as far as they can go. So, I mean, to get from 61 to 65, that doesn't sound like much, but that would require a really quite significant increase in percentage share of the vote. This is not in any way playing games with numbers. It is genuinely true. It's simply because of the way the voting system works. It's like a quirk. But getting to 61 seats is possible on these kind of percentage numbers, but to get to 65, it's a really big jump in terms of percentage vote, and it's not really achievable. In fact, it isn't achievable unless something really strange happens, simply because the SNP's approval ratings in terms of policy delivery and things like that, it's not realistic to think they're going to get back to the sort of stellar levels that they were at in 2021, 48% of the vote, which is kind of the sort of level they would need to win an overall majority. At the event this morning, the SNP and John Swinney, they said all the right things, a generation has passed effectively because so many people were too young to have a vote in the 2014 referendum. So Scotland must have the right to choose now before Nigel Farage gets in and all the rest of it. Scotland must have that right. In which case, why would you surrender that right by, in a completely unforced, unnecessary way, setting yourself an impossible threshold for what constitutes a mandate for an independence referendum and setting a precedent that could last for decades? Somebody from the SNP said on Twitter that the Westminster can't resist Scotland's right to choose forever. Well, they absolutely can resist it forever if you set a threshold that can never be met forever. And that is what is effectively happening, because under the Holyrood voting system, to win an outright majority is close to a miracle. It has happened once, we know that, but it is extraordinarily difficult, and it is perfectly possible it will never happen again, or not within a lifetime. And so, yeah, if you set yourself on a target that will never be met, then yes, it is perfectly possible that Westminster will say no forever, and that is your own responsibility because it's a completely unforced error. We've got to avoid that unforced error. We've got to avoid setting that threshold. We've got to avoid setting that really, really damaging precedent. What may be achievable at the SNP conference is to draw the leadership back a bit and to set a target, which has been used before, of a multi-party majority for a mandate for a referendum. If the SNP and Greens in combination and maybe one or two of the smaller parties reach 50% plus one of the list vote, then that would constitute a mandate for a referendum. That may be an achievable target. I know people will say, well, Westminster has ignored exactly that sort of mandate in the past, so why wouldn't they ignore it again? Well, they probably would ignore it again, but the point is we wouldn't be making life even harder for ourselves by setting an impossible target, which would become a precedent that Westminster would use against us in the future. So at least let's go back to something that isn't going to cause any harm, even if it doesn't do a lot of good. And I would really urge delegates at the SNP conference to try and modify the plan to at least make it less harmful, even if it's not actually going to win independence in the near future. Anyway, that's it for now. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you later.